you to stop. But I'll try to keep it within the parameters of this program. Now, before we begin, my name is Joseph Dowd. I'm an interpretive park ranger with the National Park Service, currently working at Raisin National Battlefield Park. I've volunteered for the National Park Service. I have started off as an intern, and I have also worked as a ranger at Horseshoe Bend National Military Park in Alabama. Now, tonight, we are going to take a look at a little studied part of a little studied conflict, of a little studied war. And that, of course, would be the War of 1812, the battles of the River Raisin, and the regular army soldiers who fought here in 1813. Now, anyone who has an interest in local history of this area is likely familiar with a general understanding of the battles of the River Raisin. They were fought in January of 1813, and they ultimately resulted in an American defeat. And the discussion that is mostly had about the battles of the River Raisin tends to focus on the Kentucky militia who fought here. The bulk of the American troops were Kentucky militia, and the actions and the sacrifice of the Kentucky militia is worthy of the study that they are given. However, there was another aspect of the American line that is often overlooked, and very likely because they did not have much in the way of benefiting the American cause during battle, and in fact, in some circles, it's considered that they are the ones who led to the defeat at River Raisin. Now, who am I talking about? Well, I am talking about the regular U.S. soldiers of the 17th and 19th United States Infantry, Winchester's regulars. Now, to begin, talk about a little bit about the commander, James Winchester. Now, General James Winchester, he was born in 1752 in Winchester, Maryland. That's now Westminster. And he served in the Continental Army during the War of Independence, captured twice, and promoted to captain by the end of that war. So he was a veteran. Now, following the war, he would move out west into the old Southwest Territory to a region that would eventually become the state of Tennessee in 1796. While out there, he worked into a prominent role within the Tennessee militia in the various wars against the natives to get them out of Tennessee in the 1790s and the 1800s. In addition to this, he also served in the state Senate, and he was a candidate for both U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. All this being said, Winchester was an old soldier, and he was the spitting image of a Tidewater aristocrat. Coming from Maryland, he brought that sense of the gentleman farmer with him to Tennessee. And in fact, if you ever visit his historic plantation home, Cragfont, which is now a historical site, it looks rather bizarre because it is a beautiful Georgian Tidewater plantation mansion in the middle of the Tennessee backwoods. Now, as war loomed in early 1812, General Winchester tenured his services not only to the Tennessee militia, but also the federal government. Now, at this time, the U.S. Army was pretty much taking anybody they possibly could that had any sort of battlefield experience. You have to remember, we're 30 years after the Revolutionary War now. Most of the men who fought in the Revolution that can still put on a uniform might not exactly be in the best fighting shape. Now, Winchester, he would be commissioned as a brigadier general in March of 1812, and he was placed in command of Military Department Number 1. That is the area encompassing Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and most of the Western territories. And initially, he was put in charge of recruiting, which we'll get into a little bit here in a minute. But almost immediately, Winchester caused controversy with the Army's organization and command structure. Now, recognizing Winchester's time and grade, and therefore his superiority to the overall commander of the Northwest Army, William Hull, Winchester would actually receive 2 offers from the adjutant general. Those offers were 1, stay in the Northwest Theater as a subordinate to General Hull, or 2, relinquish command of his current forces and any he hoped to recruit, and then proceed to the Niagara Theater, where he would be given a command under Major General Henry Dearborn. Winchester chose to remain west, and we know that maybe that wasn't the best idea in hindsight, but here he was, and shortly after, following the surrender of William Hull, his army, and Fort Detroit, Winchester now found himself in overall command of the Northwest Army. But this also would not last very long, as command would quickly be given to William Henry Harrison, a man whose popularity and strong political connections outweighed Winchester's seniority, as Winchester did outrank him by time and grade. Now, an important thing to note before we go on, when you look at generals of the U.S. forces at this time period, and for a certain amount all the way up through the Civil War, there are lots and lots of brigadier generals, and every now and then there might be a major general, but that's just about it. Following the military tradition of nobody can ever outrank George Washington. And unfortunately, because of that, you will end up with many, many brigadier generals who are technically the same rank, but now they have to start pulling hairs to see who's been in longer and who's been decorated more to try to figure out who's actually in overall command. And with that, Winchester would relieve command of the Northwest Army to William Henry Harrison, and upon that he would assume command of the left wing of the Northwestern Army, consisting of several regiments of Kentucky Volunteer Infantry, as well as the 17th and part of the 19th United States Infantry. Is there a way to turn the light on for this podium?
Yes. There you go.
Oh, that's much better. Thank you. Anyways, so Winchester takes command of the left wing of the Northwest Army, and it's with this force that he would begin his advance from Fort Wayne up the Maumee River, culminating in the battles of the River Raisin on January 18th and 22nd of 1813. Now, the American Army at the beginning of the War of 1812 is a very, very interesting subject, because it is where we really see the good intentions and lofty ideals of the Revolution put into practice, of which we find out they don't work very well. Now, following the idea of the Founding Fathers, the United States did not want to have a large standing army, because they believed a large standing army could be the tool of a tyrant to force its will on the people. So they believed in having a very small standing army, and in the time of war, you just rely on the state militias to swell the ranks. Well, they quickly learned that state militias are not the most reliable force, and they would seek to expand the army. Now, at the beginning of the War of 1812, the authorized strength of the U.S. Army was 12,000 men. That was the authorized strength. The actual strength of men present and able to serve was closer to around 6,700. And this force was scattered across the eastern portion of the continent at different forts and outposts, primarily offering constabulary duties out on the frontier. However, with the looming threat of war, Congress would pass legislation entitled An Act to Raise Additional Military Force. You can probably guess what that act set out to do. It authorized 10 additional infantry regiments to the Army's existing 7. This increased the authorized strength of the Army to over 35,000 men. But again, that's the authorized strength. You can't just pass legislation and suddenly have a 35,000 man army. You have to go out and actually find those people. And due to the reluctance by many civilian and military leaders to fully implement the act, recruitment would be slow and often disorganized throughout the summer of 1812. Now, one of the 10 new regiments for the Army was the 17th Infantry Regiment. Now, it was originally authorized by Congress to consist of 18 companies divided into 2 infantry battalions to be recruited from the 1st Military Department. Now, that's actually very interesting. The general structure of regiments in both the American and British armed forces was a single battalion regiment. And hence, that's why oftentimes when historians look at records and we look at primary sources, the term regiment and battalion is often used interchangeably. What the United States was doing here, well, what Congress was doing, is they were actually modeling the French system, the system that the Grand Armée, I can't pronounce French very well, had implemented in having very large regiments of multiple battalions. And if there was one thing you could say about the U.S. Army in the early 19th century, is it loved copying anything that Napoleon was doing. And so it was authorized as a 18 company regiment. That's massive. However, they quickly would realize that this was not feasible, given the fact that this was a Western regiment. It was to be raised out of the frontier. The 1st Military District, as I said, encompassing Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana Territory, and even farther out west, that's a big space. And to try to organize all of that into one regiment under one colonel was not going to work. So, in June of 1812, a subsequent act of Congress abolished this 2-battalion structure of the 17th. Now, by this point, recruitment had already begun, and companies were being organized. So what they did was that the 1st Battalion that had already begun recruiting rather heavily was designated the 17th Regiment. It would remain the 17th. This was the battalion that was primarily being recruited out of Kentucky. The 2nd Battalion, which was primarily being recruited out of Ohio, would be redesignated as the 19th United States Infantry. So they were now 2 separate regiments, but that really does not mean a whole lot, because as we are going to see, regimental organization during the War of 1812 was more of like a guideline, and the 17th and the 19th Infantry Regiments would be pretty much joined at the hip throughout the war. Now, they needed to go out and they needed to recruit. So recruiting parties would be sent out from Winchester's central rendezvous in Lexington to recruit throughout the military department. And to entice recruitment, the United States Congress actually did something kind of smart. I know that's a shocker. They knew that they needed to prevent an oversaturation of the officer corps, and to do this, regimental commanders would not be given a field commission until enough soldiers had been recruited to justify a colonel's command. So it actually gave them some, skin in the game. And so recruiting actually went by rather well. Now, the difficulty was the organization of the recruiting efforts. But before I get into that, why would soldiers even want to enlist? Well, you can see here, these are some of the very basic parameters of enlisting in the U.S. Army in 1812. You enlisted for 5 years. Later on, this would be changed to 3 years or the duration. You received a $16 bounty for enlisting, but you only received half at first. You would get the other half when you mustered out. A monthly pay of $6. Mind you, that's about half of what a skilled tradesman was expected to make at the time. But the real sweet spot was at the end of your service, so long as you had served honorably, you would be given a 160-acre land grant, primarily in Indiana, Illinois, or the Louisiana Territory. This was a pretty good incentive to get folks to enlist. However, contrary to popular belief and how we see service in the regular armed forces today, many citizens held negative perceptions regarding service in the regular army. See, the patriotic sentiments at the time typically placed favor in the state and local militias as keeping, again, with the idealized Republican traditions of the citizen soldier who is a soldier only when need be, and then like old Cincinnatus, he puts down his sword and takes up the plow. And so, because of that, it was seen as you could either be the noble citizen who serves in the local forces, or you can be essentially a federal gun for hire. And citizens from the upper and middle classes, more invested in their local communities, along with the opportunity to be elected into high-ranking militia positions, overwhelmingly favored the militia. And this, paired with the longer enlistments, subadequate pay, and the higher level of commitment, often meant the disadvantaged and displaced members of the community were the ones targeted by recruiters for the regular army. For the most part, unmarried, non-land-owning men would comprise the bulk of the United States regular army, essentially men who could afford to go and be a soldier for 5 years, who don't have a farm to work or a family to take care of. Now, who were these new recruits into Uncle Sam's regulars? Well, unfortunately, documentation regarding the actual men of the 17th and 19th Regiment is very sparse. So what we are going off of now are the general averages of Americans in the military in 1812 to 1814. So your average Yankee soldier was 25 to 30 years old. He was 5 foot 7 inches tall, and he weighed 145 pounds. Almost 90% were native born. And although farming was the most common profession listed at enlistment, it wasn't overwhelming. Farmers comprised about 40% of occupations listed, but the close second was skilled artisans. So tailors, shoemakers, blacksmiths at about 37%. Now, this is actually very different from the trends that we see in European armies at this time. The main reason for that is America at this time did not have very large cities with massive populations of impoverished, lower working class or immigrants that they could pull from, such as, say, London, where Wellington summed up the British soldiers as the scum of the earth. You don't see the same thing because there isn't that same pool to pull from. And that's actually one of the things that made recruiting for the regulars very difficult because, again, most of the people in the United States at this time, they had some sort of property. They had some sort of profession that you can't really just walk away from for 5 years. Now, of the small number of foreign-born recruits, the largest single group were Irish at about 52%. Now, the Yankee soldier needed to be physically fit, as he was expected to march 10 miles a day and much more if needed, with some instances requiring infantrymen to hoof it 25 miles in a day. Now, he needed to do this all while carrying around 45 pounds of equipment with him as well. Now, the recruits would be recruited and organized by company. And once a company was organized, it was then sent out to the front. Now, the general breakdown, the organization of American military units at this time consisted of a battalion. And again, most of the time, battalion and regiment were interchangeable, and that would be under the command of a colonel, occasionally a lieutenant colonel, or even a major. Each battalion would have 8 to 10 companies. 17th Regiment would have 9. Now, of that company, the company was commanded by a captain, and the company really was the home of the soldier. Very rarely were companies ever broken up and divided. They generally moved together. And for the most part, you got to know everybody in your company. It was your little community. Now, companies at this time were authorized to have 106 men in total, 90 privates, 10 non-commissioned officers, 4 officers, and 2 musicians. However, that number varied wildly. At most, we believe that the average size of a company in the 17th Regiment was about 64 men. Now, let's see, where am I at for this? Now, outside of that formal organization, one of the most important organizational structures of the Army at this time was an informal one known as the mess. The mess was a group, usually of 5 to 6 men, who would group together and essentially keep each other from dying. So this means cooking together, sharing sleeping quarters, and distributing the load. So what I mean by that is a mess typically would be assigned one common tent. So that's usually a 6 by 5 foot tent that, again, 5 to 6 men were going to be curled up in, sleeping. They received a 4-gallon camp kettle, 2 tin pans, and occasionally additional equipment, shovels, axes, things like that. Now, where the mess was important is that it allowed men to switch off who has to carry the pans, who has to carry the shovel, in addition to all of their gear. The tents themselves would typically be carried in a regimental wagon following the unit. Now, of what would you cook in this mess? Well, your typical soldier's fare was usually consisted of a daily ration of 3/4 of a pound of salted beef or pork, a pound of flour or bread. At this time is when we start to see the introduction of hard bread being issued to the Army. Now, hard bread or hardtack had been used in the Navy for a long, long time up to this point, but we start to see hard bread being issued to the infantry as they started to realize issuing soldiers flour in the field is not a very efficient way to get calories in them. And that's the whole point of issuing rations, is to shovel fuel into the army so it can do what you need it to do. Now, in addition to flour and beef, which were the two main staples, they would also receive a daily ration of 1 gill of whiskey. That's about a shot and a half. And in addition to this, a company would also be issued a supply of candles, soap, and vinegar. Yes, they were issued soap. People did bathe back then. It's a common misconception that for some reason everybody thinks that everyone born before 1900 were filthy mud creatures. No, people like to be clean, just like we like to be clean today. So they were issued soap and they did use soap. Now, vinegar was actually a very important part of the ration because vinegar at this time to soldiers was essentially like Gatorade. It had electrolytes and it had salt, which was very important. Now, I, for one, don't like the idea of just having to pound back vinegar, but if you're out in the field and you need electrolytes, vinegar was actually very handy for that. It would also be used in cooking. And in addition to that basic ration, they would also, on occasion, receive a rotation of potatoes, rice, peas, occasionally raisins. But for the most part, not really any fruits or vegetables. Scurvy was a common problem in the Army as well as the Navy. Now, here's where we start getting into some interesting stuff with the 17th. Now, actually, before I go on, I apparently missed a slide, but so to back up a little bit in terms of the timeline that we're talking here. So the 17th and the 19th begin being recruited in the summer of 1812, and the problem with the recruiting was that they were raised by company, and each company was sent out to the front as soon as that company was organized. And so the 17th and the 19th regiments never once fielded as a regiment. All of the companies were never all in the same place at once for them to actually be a regiment. This was actually a very common thing in American military units at the time. Now, a good example of this is that the company of the 19th United States under Captain Langan was raised and organized, and as soon as they were dispatched to Urbana to join General Winchester's force, where they then joined the 17th. So we say that the 17th and the 19th U.S. were in Winchester's army and they fought at the River Raisin. In reality, it was the 17th Regiment with a company of the 19th under Langan who never saw the 19th. So they, for all intents and purposes, were adopted members of the 17th. And because of that, from this point forward, I am just going to use the 17th Regiment because it's a lot of word soup to constantly say the 17th and the 19th and go back and forth. But for all intents and purposes, anytime we are talking about the 17th Regiment, we are also including those components of the 19th that were folded in and under the command of the 17th. Now, with these many new soldiers coming into the army in 1812, well, they had to be uniformed, obviously. And the regulations for the United States Army for its infantry was updated at the beginning of 1812. And a private was expected to be issued the following as their full, complete uniform. They would be given a hat, a shako, as we call it now, but a cylindrical felt cap, a uniform coat, blue, red cuffs and collar, and white lace, because white was the color of the infantry at this time. They received a vest, woolen overalls, linen overalls, trousers, a fatigue frock, 4 shirts, 4 pairs of shoes. That's supposed to say 4, not 1. 4 pairs of shoes, 2 pairs of socks, 2 pairs of stockings, a blanket, a neck stock, and 1 pair of gaiters. Now, that being said, items such as the shirts and the shoes, they were not given 4 pairs at the beginning and told to keep track of them. You were allotted 4 throughout the year. And if 4 pairs of shoes sounds excessive, well, we know that during the Civil War, just 50 years later, a Union infantryman on heavy campaign was expected to wear through a new pair of shoes in about 3 weeks. So 4 shoes actually might have been kind of on the lower side of things. Now, this list that you see here, I said this is what the average soldier was supposed to receive. Yeah, guess what? That didn't happen. Now, the problem that they had was that the Army had suddenly gone from an authorized strength of 10,000 men to 35,000. However, they didn't really do anything to try to increase the capacity of the support structure of the Army to actually supply a force that was now 3 times as large. And this led to an absolutely terrible time in the commissary department during the War of 1812. And to also show you just how unprepared the United States was, the quartermaster department had only been founded in May. Yeah. And now one of the biggest problems facing the Army was a shortage of blue wool cloth for uniforms. You obviously need that because when you are part of Uncle Sam's Boys in Blue, you need a lot of blue. And so they began getting a little lenient with it. It doesn't have to be a particular shade of blue. Okay, it can just be a darker color. Okay, fine, whatever wool you have. And so in 1812, we saw some very interesting things. Some regiments were being issued orange uniforms, brown, and purple. And for some soldiers in the Northwest Army, they actually received coats from the 104th Regiment of Foot, the British Army. They were captured. A transport ship was captured by American privateers, and the commissary department bought it on the cheap, issued it out, and just told them to change the buttons. Now, when it comes to the 17th Regiment, they were primarily outfitted in the uniform that they received when they first enlisted. Now, with this uniform crisis occurring, the stopgap measure for the U.S. Army was to construct a boatload of linen summer uniforms. So this consisted of a linen round coat, which for any Civil War historians out there, this is basically the granddaddy of the shell jacket, and a pair of linen overalls. Now, when you hear me use the term overall, I'm not talking about bibs. The term overall at this time primarily applied to trousers that were tight-fitting and usually buttoned closed at the ankle and were kind of a blend of trousers and gaiters. Those are known as overalls. And so many of the new regiments were outfitted in this linen suit, essentially as a stopgap measure to hold them over until woolen uniforms could be provided. Now, this is also just a very fascinating example of the commissary department being so efficient with what they could do. Now, I'm going to step away from the mic for a second. The round coat, you notice it's very, very short, and you can see that its shoulder seams are pretty far back, right? Well, that is because the wonderful round coat was the army vest that they started putting sleeves on. And in fact, in some quartermaster returns, they are even just listed as waistcoats with sleeves. But again, it was a stopgap measure, and it was able to outfit them in something. Now, the men in Winchester's army were never even supposed to get linen round coats. You see, the actual regulations called for that anybody serving south of the Potomac would receive a linen coat. Anybody serving north of the Potomac received a woolen coat. But again, there's no wool to be had. So they just had to make do with what they had. Let's see, what's the next one? Okay, I'll get back to that. Now, while most units would receive proper winter clothing by the fall of 1812, the 17th would not be so lucky. Well aware of the oncoming Midwest winter, Winchester would send multiple requests for warm clothing to be sent forward to his army. In a letter to General Harrison on October 26, Winchester would write, "It is painful to the feeling mind to see the situation of the regulars on a frosty morning." Now, to give you an idea of this, when I'm talking about a linen coat, I want you to remember what's linen usually used for today? Tablecloths. So imagine having a coat made out of a tablecloth, and that's all you have. Now, shortly after this letter to Harrison, Winchester would finally receive word from Commissary General Callender Irvine, who's the Commissary General was kind of the predecessor to the Quartermaster General. Commissary General Callender Irvine told Winchester that he would soon receive winter clothing, and in fact, it was en route to his army, having left Philadelphia in early September. Winchester received this and shared it with his men on October 27th, so actually only a day after he had written this complaint to Harrison. With great pleasure, the general announces to the army the prospect of an early supply of winter clothing, amongst which are the following articles shipped from Philadelphia on the 9th of September. 10,000 pairs of shoes, 5,000 blankets, 5,000 round jackets, 5,000 pairs of pantaloons, woolen. So this is very, very good news. But would not come to be. Now, it is true that this shipment would be sent out from Philadelphia to Winchester's army in early September. But let's think for a second what that shipment had to go through. That shipment of clothing, which, if you're talking about 5,000 coats, that's a pretty large number of parcels. This shipment would have to go from Philadelphia, overland, westward, over the mountains, to Fort Fayette, modern-day Pittsburgh, which was the main supply depot for the Western Army. From there, it could be loaded up onto a flatboat, and it could be taken down the Ohio River. From there, it would finally reach Newport, across the river from Cincinnati on the Kentucky side, which was the site of the Newport Barracks, which also acted as a major depot. From there, they would figure out what articles had to go to where, and then the very difficult task of figuring out where the heck different units were. Because you can't just call them on the phone and say, hey, Colonel Wells, where are you at? So a lot of times they just had a general idea of, okay, General Winchester's army is probably somewhere between Fort Wayne and Detroit. And once they had located where they were to go, they then would have to get there. And this is where we see the failure, in part, both to the harsh winter that they faced in 1812 to 1813, and also a seemingly lackluster effort on the part of General Harrison to push supplies towards Winchester. Now, it was no secret that Winchester and Harrison had a bit of a rivalry. Winchester wasn't particularly cheesed about having to give up his command, being a senior officer, to Harrison because Harrison had better connections, and Harrison didn't really like associating with Winchester at all. And so it is not fair to say that Harrison intentionally sabotaged Winchester's army, but it is pretty apparent that he wouldn't lift a fat rat finger to help. Now, in the case of this warm clothing, it got to Fort Jennings, which is south of modern-day Defiance. And in fact, it got to within 30 miles of Winchester in December of 1812. Now, Winchester knew that it was there, but he didn't have a means to get there. So once again, he would fire off to Harrison. So, my dear general, turn your attention to the clothing for our regulars. It is distressing to see their situation since the commencement of cold weather, barefoot and in other respects clad in a few linen rags. And also, excuse me, the date is wrong on that. That is November 26th that this is coming from. Now, with this, Winchester was actually faced with a difficult dilemma. Now, he was currently at Fort Winchester, near modern-day Defiance. His supplies of not just clothing, but food, ammunition, all sorts of military equipage was currently sitting at Fort Jennings, only 30 miles away. But the problem was Winchester had no possible way of getting his men there or getting the supplies to him because all of his horses had been without forage for about 2 weeks, and they weren't going anywhere, let alone carry anything. His men would not be able to march through the frozen swamps. Most of them did not have shoes. And the ice jams on the Maumee had smashed the dozen or so pirogues or dugout canoes that they had built for the purpose of getting to Fort Jennings. So Winchester was in a little bit of a bind. And this would continue, and one of the last mentions we have of it is actually from one of the very last dispatches from General James Winchester in late December, where he noted that the small portion of donated clothing from the state of Kentucky that had been sent to his militia were actually having to be shared among the regulars too, because they were so destitute. And he would go on to write, my favorite thing I've ever seen from General Winchester, where he would write to Harrison, my regulars are as they came into this world. Oh, wow. Now, the reason why I focused for quite a bit on the uniforms is because this is very likely one of the main factors that led to the events at the River Raisin. Because Winchester, he couldn't retreat, he couldn't get up the frozen and ice-jammed Maumee, he couldn't stay at the rapids, there's no food, so where else was there to go? So it is, it can be argued that one of the reasons, or the main reason, that Winchester even ventured north to the River Raisin was not just because he wanted to, because he had to. Now, you might think, well, that's also 30 miles, and it's 30 miles north. That's true. However, Winchester's force, when they would come north, they marched across the frozen Maumee Bay, which was flat. And for the most part, a lot easier to march than through ice jams and frozen or half-frozen swamps. And at this point, Winchester was also ordering his men to make moccasins out of the green hides of the cattle that they were slaughtering to feed their men. So, all that being said, the 17th U.S. would march forward, and they would arrive here at the River Raisin following the first battle on January 18th. They would come up in support of the Kentucky militia, and where they would be encamped out on the right flank. And if any of you are at all familiar with the story of the battles of the River Raisin, pretty much know what happens from there. The regulars were caught out in the open. They gave a decent defense for a little while, but inevitably had to fall back. And their falling back quickly turned into a rout. And from there, the entire American line quickly collapsed. So it's not the most dashing military endeavor. However, again, when you take into consideration everything that these guys had been through, and we don't even have time to touch on all of the supply issues with just food for the army. These regulars, they were in rags, they were in linen suits in January in Michigan, and also we have not been able to find any evidence that the regimental wagons accompanied them to the River Raisin. I remind you that the regimental wagons are where the tents are kept. So it's very likely that the 17th was also bivouacked just out in the open in 1.5 feet of snow. You take all of that into consideration, and it's not surprising why the events of the River Raisin played out as they did. Now, we have dug very hard recently to uncover a lot of this information, and particularly the whole idea of the uniforms regarding the 17th has been a very interesting research and discussion, because essentially ask every 1812 historian and they will tell you something else. But the most recent evidence that we have been able to uncover here at River Raisin Battlefield, going through the original ledgers, really supports the idea that the regulars were probably lucky if they still had pants at this point. And I want to remind you, we're talking about January, and not only surviving, but having to fight. Now, the elements of the 17th that would fight at the River Raisin, it was about, we believe, between 300 to 400 men under command of the companies of Edwards, Hightower, Meade, and Langham. That portion of the 17th, which was about half of the regiment, the other half was still down in Ohio with Colonel Wells, was almost completely obliterated. A handful of them would be those few 33 that would escape back to Ohio, but for the most part, the men of the 17th that fought here at the River Raisin, almost none of them made it out. Now, that being said, although this portion of the 17th was destroyed, elements of the 17th remaining in Ohio under Colonel Wells, they would continue to see service. Soon after the River Raisin, the 17th would see action at Fort Meigs during its siege. And the 17th would also aid Major George Crowan in the defense of Fort Stevenson in Sandusky. The 17th would remain in service for the remainder of the war, and they would be sent everywhere and they would do everything. Unfortunately, I do not have the time or the patience to actually go through everywhere that they went, but essentially, if you can imagine a theater or a major battle in the War of 1812, it's very likely that members of the 17th were there in small detachments, usually a company here, a company there, even as small as platoons or squads. We know for a fact they would fight at Fort Erie, they would fight at Chippewa, Lundy's Lane, retaking Mackinac. Some of them would be sent out to Natchez. Another contingent would find its way into Andy Jackson's army at the Battle of New Orleans. They went everywhere, they did everything, and for the most part, they went unrecognized. And this is the unfortunate reality of many of the fighting men of the War of 1812 due to the fragmentary nature of the structure of the army at this time. Regiments and units very rarely gained a name for themselves or gained a reputation. During the Civil War, we're all very, very familiar with the Stonewall Brigade and the Irish Brigade and the things that they did. But for the fighting men in the era of the early Republic, they did their job. They went in, they fought, they went wherever Uncle Sam decided to send them, and they did their job. Now, in 1814, Congress would pass legislation to consolidate their army because what they realized is that they had over 44 regiments scattered everywhere, and some of these regiments were down to maybe 15, 20 men. And those 15, 20 men might be in 3 different states. And so in 1814, Congress would pass legislation consolidating the 26th and the 27th regiments, also from Ohio, into the 17th and the 19th. And then later that year, the 19th regiment would also be folded into the 17th, which is rather ironic given that they were meant to be one regiment at the very beginning. And in 1815, as the war came to a close and the army began decreasing its size, the remaining elements of the 17th U.S., which we believe was about 5 companies, which we have no idea where they were at this point, they were merged with other wartime units into the 4th United States Infantry, an active Army regiment to this very day. So the old 4th Regiment of the U.S. Army, they can trace their lineage back to, in part, the 17th Regiment, including the unit that fought here at the River Raisin. Thank you. All right. Are there any questions? Yes.
Have there been any published or personal accounts of members of the 17th that left behind any kind of records that you're aware of?
Unfortunately, not to our knowledge. So far as we know, there are no published accounts of men from the 17th. Most of what we know about their actions comes from the orderly books of James Winchester, of which we have to remember that the 17th was only one of multiple regiments under his command. And again, due to the fragmentary nature of the unit and how it served, there may be accounts out there, but also many of the men were counted in other regiments if their detachment was with them. Case in point, the 19th Company that was with the 17th. So, to our knowledge, unfortunately, no. Although we would love to find one. Yes.
So the only thing different between the militia and the regulars were their terms of enlistment. The regulars weren't better organized or had any training.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think that is something that is a misconception by many of us today. Is that we think of the regular army, we think of the regular army of the Civil War and also the 20th century. Well organized, well supplied, hard hitting. Well, that was not the case. Yeah, if anything, the many times the regulars were worse off because if you found yourself in a bad situation in a bad unit that was undersupplied and undermanned, well, good luck because you're in that for 5 years. So, yeah, for the most part, there's a reason why most people chose to serve in the militia than the regular army. Yes.
Did all of those goods ever wind up catching up to anybody, or did they just wind up getting sold off or captured, or what happened to them?
Yes, actually, that's a good question, and it's actually I wasn't able to get to this. So the 17th that wasn't destroyed at River Raisin, they would eventually be issued proper uniforms, kind of. They received the uniform coat, the wool coat, complete with the red cuffs and collar and the white trim, except instead of blue, they were black. But by that point, I don't think they were complaining. For the most part, it seems that the shipment that was bound for Winchester of the woolen round coats that got caught up at Fort Jennings, we actually haven't been able to figure out what exactly happened to it. Our best guess is that it probably was used to equip other units or even possibly the militia after the River Raisin, because with the winter and everything, it probably wasn't even accessible until closer to March or maybe even April, long after Winchester's men needed them. All right. Oh, yes.
So the officers probably all had nice warm coats, uniforms, and the regulars that walk around half naked.
So that is a good question. We're not really sure. And it is something that I have wondered. Now, in fact, depending on where you were and what the situation was, sometimes officers actually had things a lot worse than their men, because you need to remember officers were not permitted to draw from public stores. Your uniform you had to buy yourself. Now, if you are a colonel or a major or something, that's probably not an issue, and in fact, you probably own multiple sets. If you are a lieutenant or a captain, there's many accounts, not from the 17th, but there are other accounts from other units where the company grade officers, one, there was mentions of them not being easily distinguished from the men because they were also so dirty and ragged, but they also had a really scrape by because, one, yeah, it's one thing if you have to pay for your uniform yourself. Where are you going to get a new pair of pants in the middle of the wilderness in January? And so it's easy to it's probably easy to say that the lower ranking officers, they probably were in it just as bad as the men were. Yes.
Do you think there will be an opportunity for the commanding officer, commanding general of the fourth division to come to the anniversary?
Let's talk.
And the reason why I said is because I found Lieutenant Colonel Clark is direct Senate. But unfortunately, we have red tape in Canada because of, what happens to the truck.
Yeah.
Or and so forth. So the British are really would not be too fond of the quote unquote embarrassment of war.
Yeah, let's definitely talk afterwards. Thank you. Yes.
You mentioned that their tents would normally be part of the supply wagons. Were there limitations on how many wagons they had and horses otherwise that they're having to haul tents themselves?
Yes. The regulations called for each company to have one wagon. Now, the wagon was responsible for carrying not only the common tents, but also the kitchen equipment, as well as any of the officers' baggage. But again, a problem that we have for Winchester's army in particular is that they had the wagons, but they didn't have the horsepower. Because again, they were in a country without forage, and many of these horses were so weak they were not able to pull the wagons. And from the march from Fort Winchester, modern day Defiance, to the Rapids, many of the wagons actually had to be man hauled, as it was the only way because they did not have the horses to pull them. But the regulations was one wagon per company, and on a good day, good campaign, that's what they would have.
How many horses would be per wagon?
I believe that a army wagon at that point would have had 4 Conestoga horses. Conestoga horses were a breed of horse that was developed in western Pennsylvania specifically for hauling Conestoga wagons. The War of 1812 pretty much made them extinct. That's another fun fact. But about 4 horses, I believe. Yes?
There's an area in the south that's originally named Winchester.
Mm-hmm.
Supposedly that was where they set up camp. Do you know if there's any record of that or how long they were there?
Unfortunately, I do not off the top of my head. So I can't say yes or no, but it's very possible. Yes.
You comment on the account that says that the 17th was potentially stationed outside of the stockade to the right of the line as a position of honor for Raisin.
Oh, certainly, yes. So the 17th U.S., when they arrived here at the River Raisin settlement, they were placed to the right of where the militia were camped throughout the homes and the yards of the habitants. They were to the right, and they were out in the open. Now, there was 2 main reasons for this. One, for the most part, you generally didn't mix regulars and militia together at this time. For one, they don't really like each other. The regulars see the militia as untrained and undisciplined, which they were. The militia saw the regulars as basically sellouts to their state. They're only doing this for the Silver Eagles and the land grant, doubly so because the 17th was also raised out of Kentucky. But also, the position on the right of a military battle line was the position of honor at the time. And you see this throughout armies and throughout wars. For instance, typically the right company of a regiment is like where your grenadiers would be, right? They are your best troops that you have. And so Winchester wanted to put them out on the right. But unfortunately, that also meant putting them in an exposed position, which ultimately would lead to that position being overrun during the second battle. Did that answer your question at all? All right. Well, if any of you have any other questions, I'd be happy to talk with you. You're welcome to come on up, but I want to thank you for coming out, and I want to thank the Historical Society for having me. And if you haven't been out to the battlefield recently, we are open again, so hopefully you'll come visit us soon. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely.
How you doing?
Hey, good to see ya. I didn't even see you out there.
Right there.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I got here late.
Oh, gotcha. Well, hope you thought it was worth your time and everything like that.
I don't know much about the organizing golf. I know I had relatives that fought in it.
Yeah.
In the first Michigan militia.
Mm.
One great uncle was a spy outside Fort Dix.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was eventually killed by the Potawatomi on the Raisin River.
Oh, yeah?
And his brother, my direct ancestor, must have been there at the same time because he went back later and recovered the remains and brought them back to Detroit.
Oh, wow.